Hello, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to you, you thirsty bunch of beer drinkers, whenever and wherever you're tuning in from. Thanks for pressing play and supporting a Canadian podcast. I'm Troy Birch with Great Lakes, Ontario's local brewery, a fiercely independent craft brewery based in Etobicoke who brings you this here Between Two Fermenters, the podcast where craft beer and conversation collide straight from the tanks to your ears. How about that last episode, number 50, featuring Peter Bullitt? He really opened up and he shed some tears, which was nice to see. Showed the emotional side and the personal side of him, but he really opened up and shared some great stories about GLB, the industry, and much more. If you haven't caught it yet, look right below in your podcast feed and give it a listen. And there's going to be questions. If there's something I didn't ask him that you want to know about Peter Bullitt and or Great Lakes, shoot us an email at podcast@greatlakesbeer.com and I'll corner him in the hallway and get right back to you. But that was last week. Today on the pod, I'm joined by someone who brings more than just insight into beer. He brings decades of experience, sharp analysis, and a deep understanding of how alcohol policy and regulation shapes our industry. My guest is Dr. Dan Malleck, professor and chair of the Department of Health Sciences at Brock University. Dan is an internationally recognized expert in drug and alcohol regulation in Ontario, holding a PhD in the history of medicine. He is the author of 5 books, including the influential Liquor in the Liberal State and Try to Control Yourself, both essential reads for anyone interested in the history and politics of alcohol regulation. Beyond academia, I need to go back to school. Beyond academia, Dan is a consultant on alcohol policy and a sought-after speaker at craft brewers conferences across the country. What he covers and the clarity in which he covers it has real immediate importance for our industry. Most recently, he testified before the Canadian Senate on the controversial bill that has major implications for alcohol policy and alcohol companies across Canada. He's also been outspoken about the Canadian Centre on Substance Abuse and Addiction, that is the CCSA, their low-risk drinking guidelines, offering strong evidence-based critiques and commentary. If you've ever wondered whether the global temperance movement is still a force here in Canada, well, Dan has thoughts. Some big ones. We're going to get into all that and more with Dan, but right now, I'm going to crack a Great Lakes Lager. So buckle up, grab a fresh one, crack it open, and let's get right at it. Hang tight. We'll be right back with Dr. Dan Malleck.
It's Great Lakes Brewery, a fiercely independent craft brewery. We believe in supporting communities, good times, and brewing amazing beer. It's Great Lakes Brewery. Order online for free local home delivery. In the GTA, good times and amazing beer. That's GLB.
Hello, Dan.
Hey, how you doing?
It's a pleasure to have you on the show. Thanks for making the time and the trip from wherever you came from.
From St. Catharines.
From St. Catharines. Before you dig into that beer, because I know that's something you've been looking at that. You're ready to go for that. You're going to have a stocking toe. But before I get you a beer, okay, I want to clear the air right away. You're not being paid to be here.
No, not at all.
You are not performing work for GLB, for the Ontario or Canadian beer industry or any beer company at this moment on this show?
No, I am not.
The thoughts, comments, and discussion we're about to have between two fellas, or is between two fellas who enjoy beer, love our industry, love history, and want people to know about what's going on out there in alcohol, namely beer regulation. Is that correct?
I think that pretty much captures it.
Okay,
yeah.
I wanted to get that right out because I did watch your the testimony in the Senate. So I wanted, if anyone's critiquing this later on, I want people to be well aware that this is Dan and I having a good, fun, honest, frank discussion about the state of alcohol regulation in Canada.
Yeah.
Now you can have that beer. All right, get that beer in.
So I have to do this.
Yeah, right into the mic.
That work?
And it just sounds so good. So Dan, our paths first crossed, I believe it was at the 2024 Ontario Craft Brewers Conference. Mm-hmm. We were waiting in line for a bus, and then we got on the bus, and then I think we eventually just kind of like, who are you? Who am I? Oh, okay, you're that guy. You're that guy. But we've had some communication since then with my work with the coalition of Canadian craft Brewers, the independent alliance, and I completely butchered that. That was the Coalition of Canadian Independent Craft Brewers. But yeah, you testified in the Senate, and we've shared some thoughts back and forth.
Oh yeah.
And about the CCSA, which we'll get into later. But I just wanted to get you on the show because I really think you have great insight. You have a great message that members of our industry and those that support the industry, not just beer, but the whole alcohol business, deserve to hear. So hope to cover the whole gamut of that today. Sound good to you?
Absolutely. Sounds great.
So Dan, I provided that bio at the top of the show. For listeners who might not know who you are or your work, how do you describe what you do, preferably in less than 1 pint?
Okay, so less than 1 pint, I'm going to do it. I am a historian of medicine, and I study the history of alcohol and drug policy. So most of it, well, the drug stuff I've looked at Canada-wide. My PhD my doctoral dissertation was on the origins of Canada's drug laws, and I'm interested in origin stories. Like, how did we get the liquor laws we have? How do we get the drug laws we have? And then what sort of forces come into play when looking at policy? And I also teach policy in a health sciences program. And I tell my students, like, why is a historian teaching policy? Because all policy has a history. There are things that came together to make it happen. So when things like the CCSA report and the bill S202 came in, I was looking at it from a historical and a policy perspective. And that's what I do, and I talk about this probably too much to my students.
And that's at Brock University.
That's at Brock University, yeah.
And you just mentioned the two big things. But policy, you're saying, does shape history, or it creates history, I would say.
Yeah, it's sort of I see it like as a point on the journey. So there's all this stuff leading up to the creation of a policy. Normally policies don't happen without some kind of forces in play, some things that happened before, and then it in turn affects where things go. Yeah. Right. Sometimes a lot of the predictions are about really bad outcomes of policy. So say when the beer store was when beer sales in Ontario started to go into the supermarkets, people were freaking out. It's like, yeah, that's not really a big deal as far as like social problems go. But there's a lot of those sorts of predictions. And because I also study the history of alcohol, I've looked at the history of temperance, right? And so how those ideas and those voices shaped perceptions of drinking. And that's one of the things I talk about a lot with, wherever I can.
So how long have you been doing this kind of research?
I started, my master's thesis was on the history of the temperance union the temperance movement in Ontario. Okay. And that was back in we'll say the early 90s.
Okay.
But then I came to the LCBO research and the Ontario liquor policy research in the early 2000s. I kind of got away from it with the drug history, and then at Brock, someone said to me, hey, we're doing a project and we kind of want to talk about alcohol because we're in Niagara and it's a wine region, so why don't you come on board? And my question was, what happened in Ontario when prohibition ended here, but it continued across the across the river in the U.S. So that sort of led to a lot of those sort of origin stories about, okay, well, how did we get these ideas that shaped the Liquor Control Board? And then I kind of kept going back. So my recent book is kind of like a prequel
to everything.
Yeah.
But so that is that what drew you to the study of alcohol regulation and policy history? Was it someone just said, "Hey, we want to work on this"? And
that was what got me back to booze.
Okay.
But then the recent stuff
back to booze.
Well, I mean, let's be honest. Yeah. I'm an academic. Yeah. Most of us are never away from booze. But what got me into sort of the current discussion was when the CCSA's report came out, and I know we'll talk about that along the Canadian Centers on Substance Use and Addiction, when they came out with this guidance on low-risk drinking, I read it and saw temperance all over it. Like the language of temperance, the kind of assumptions that the temperance industry made, and the way temperance shaped a kind of a narrative around drinking as only harmful, without any benefits. You have to do as little as possible. If you're really smart, you'd stop altogether. Like that kind of language was throughout it, and it just really irritated me because I knew that that was a very narrow view, and it was historically problematic as well because we humans have lived with alcohol since before we were actually humans. right? Yeah.
Well, it's been around for
Yes.
literally forever.
But it's also because, ripe fruit ferments, and pre-humans were frugivores. We actually drank or ate fermented fruit as part of our, as we evolved. Right?
Yeah.
So it's actually something that is part of our physiology.
But I think I saw a warning sign on one of the apple trees way back, and I'm just joking. You're the author of 5 books, correct?
Two of them are edited collections, and 3 of them are what we call monographs, which is like a single author book. Yeah,
Okay. So as an amateur, a Canadian beer historian, I like to say that I find your titles very interesting. Tell me about your books. Some that don't have anything to do with beer, like in general, but surround the prohibition and the impact policies, the legislative decisions that they had on our country. So if you can shine some light on them.
Yeah. So the first book was Try to Control Yourself, which I still maintain is an inspired title. And
I love that. That's such a great title.
Yeah. It's something I used to say to people. I'd say something, hey, try to control yourself. And then I realized that's a really good title for this book. Mm-hmm. And it is the creation of the Liquor Control Board of Ontario after Prohibition ended in 1927. And it was more about public drinking. So when Prohibition ended in 27, you could buy booze at wineries, breweries, or at the liquor store. And it wasn't until 1934 that you could go to a bar and drink it, or go to a hotel beverage room and drink it. So I looked at how they kind of reintroduced alcohol in the sort of shadow of temperance, because the temperance movement, even though Prohibition ended, was still very active and very verbal to the government. They were lobbying the government every time something went wrong. They'd say, see, this is bad, and all that stuff. And so I just kind of, my question was, what happened? How did this, as I said earlier, what happened when Prohibition continued across the river? But really, how did they reintroduce something that had been framed as so problematic, right? And my conclusion was that I kind of expected to see a lot of temperance language in the LCBO's offices, but in fact, they wanted people to drink, but they wanted people to drink the right way, in the right places, so to undermine the illegal drinking spaces and to undercut kind of the bootleggers and that,
and
so they
could
control it. But also the whole idea is that people want to drink, so let's give them a way to drink, but drink in a way that's responsible and sort of fits a certain way of drinking. And we sort of had that legacy for the next 100 years, because it was really tough to change, for governments to sort of get the will to change the rules. And also the LCBO was a big moneymaker for the government, so that there's that incentive. My second book is called, I'm not a big fan of the title of this book. It's When Good Drugs Go Bad. It was a kind of
it's catchy.
It was it's kind of a cliche in my business and in like alcohol and drug history, but I used it because my publisher didn't like the original title, but I'm going to fight for a revision of that title, which was Its Baneful Influences Are Too Well Known, which is about the origins of Canada's drug laws. So we have an Opium Act. We had an Opium Act in 1908, and I wanted to know how we got to the place where addiction is considered a problem, because it's kind of a weird question, but like, why is addiction itself a problem? And it's a problem because of the substance people are addicted to and the inavailability and things like that. But I wanted to get to this question of how we got to the point where government took over something that at the time wasn't really considered to be something a federal government should do, which is stopping people from doing things. May seem weird now because we have all sorts of prohibitive laws, but that's where it started, right? And that was from my PhD dissertation, but I expanded it because there were things I hadn't really wrestled with. And then the third book is Liquor in the Liberal State, which was sort of an accidental book. That may sound really weird, but
it's a pretty hefty book looking at it.
It is.
That's a big accidental mistake.
I mean, it wasn't an accident when it was finished, but I was invited to talk at a conference on the Victorian pub in the UK, and I thought, how do we get the rules around drinking spaces in Ontario that we had when the LCBO started, right? And so I just kept going back. And so I got back to the 1860s and saw that this was a whole process of sort of taking the licensing from municipal councils and from municipalities and putting it in the hands of the the provincial government and provincial inspectors. And so it was a long process, but it was also this struggle between temperance and people who wanted to drink, not necessarily just industry, but the everyday people, and their ideas of freedom. Like what is freedom? What does liberty mean? That's why it's called liquor in the liberal state, because this idea of, the temperance movement were saying alcohol will enslave you, and it's this terrible king alcohol and all of this stuff that will, the demon rum, right, that will take your freedom, right?
Gin Street versus beer lane.
Well, yeah, they wouldn't talk about that too much because beer in that framing was a good thing.
It was a good thing, yeah.
But by this time, the temperance movement was, well, the
organized
evangelical temperance movement said that alcohol, full stop, is bad. But the industry and everyday people were saying, but we're a liberal society. We are allowed to do what we want as long as it doesn't hurt other people. So how come you're telling us we can't make these choices? And so part of it is the story of the policy formation and kind of the pressures that were on government. And governments did not want to pass any prohibitive laws. They knew they wouldn't work. They knew that if people want something, they'll get it. And especially with something like booze, which fermentation is a natural process. It's not that hard to get to make booze. It's not always easy to make booze that won't kill you, right? If you're going to distill, for example. Booze, yeah, I mean, the whole brewing thing is it's not going to kill you, but when you get into distilling, there's a lot of problems there. So it was all those tensions around freedom and around government's role in people's lives and all of that stuff. And so I got to that. So that's kind of like the prehistory. And my next project, believe it or not, I'm going to finish the trilogy by doing prohibition.
Good.
Because I haven't looked at prohibition yet.
Well, that's next. We're going to talk about that next, but I just want to stay on the thread of your book, Liquor in the Liberal State. I'm sure you cover it in the book, but how beer specifically played a role in shaping the Canadian identity through the alcohol regulations and policies that were put in place from 1862 to, I guess, to where the book ended?
Yeah, that's a good question. Because a lot of times, although the temperance industry, I call them the temperance industry because there are people being paid to do this job. Although they were talking about alcohol as a general thing, and they'd use terms like John Barleycorn or the demon rum, beer was still there, and it was very contested because it was lighter in alcohol than spirits. And some people saw it as more of a temperance drink, right? So a lot of the laws that were proposed would exclude cider and beer, or some people wanted to exclude cider and beer cider, and sometimes wine, and just focus on spirits. And I mean, part of that was also the brewing industry, the growing brewing industry, names like Labatt and Carling and Molson, who were very active politically in sort of shaping, or I can't say shaping, but amplifying such ideas.
Standing up for their own products.
But also the fact that especially as more lighter lagers and things like that were coming into production, it was very much seen as sort of a solution to heavy drinking of spirits. Like if you go out for a drink and you're having a glass of beer instead of a glass of whiskey, you are probably not going to have the kind of problems that the temperance movement were seeing outside of the taverns. And I'll emphasize it was outside of the tavern. So they would walk past a tavern and see a few guys drunk outside, not every tavern, not every day. And they would go, oh, look at the disaster. I mean, this place must be horrible. Not going in and seeing people enjoying each other's company, people making work contacts, people, a lot of taverns were places you could have a place to sleep or get a cheap meal. So they didn't look at that stuff. They just looked at the little bit of drunkenness. And then sometimes there was more drunkenness because of sort of various taxation regimes and stuff like that. So back to your question about beer. Beer was offered as one solution. And when we look at the way the data isn't great for that time, but it looks like more beer was being consumed and less spirits were being consumed. So even though drinking seemed to plateau, the type of drinking people were doing, and as the population was growing, was actually suggesting a more temperate society, not dry, not abstinent, but temperate. So what we might call more responsible drinking or something.
Or as the LCBO says, social responsibility.
Yeah.
So, but how did it shape the Canadian identity from a historian's perspective? and someone with a doctorate in medicine.
Yeah,
history of medicine. Sorry.
A lot of the identity shaping actually was post-prohibition. So, I mean, as much as there was beer, a lot of beer around, after prohibition, a lot of breweries closed. You might know a bit about this and
the consolidation,
the
and
consolidation,
EP Taylor,
and Taylor for sure. But things like the way you could advertise was really restricted, and so, for example, during the Second World War, you couldn't just advertise your product like in the papers, but you could put, I guess you'd call them sort of social messaging in advertising. So, like Dow's Brewery could put an ad in saying, remember to bring all of your scrap. Your rags to the depot, sponsored by Dow's, right? Yeah. That sort of thing. And that sort of what they started to do. I mean, this is one of the great things about the industry, and any industry, is like you work around the rules. So what they started to do was actually kind of invent social messaging, like the winter birds of Canada, and there would be a little ad about some winter bird of Canada, and then by Labatt's, right? Yeah. And then they weren't supposed to put specific product names in, but it would be like Carling, was it Red Cap, I think? Red Cap, and then, the great boxing moves of so-and-so, right? So it kind of got into this idea of building on these stereotypes of Canadianism or of Canadiana. There was like when Americans come to Canada looking for a great place to go, don't, be a good neighbor and tell them where to go. Like tell them to go like to Muskoka, or where to go for hunting or fishing.
Sponsored by.
Yeah, exactly. So it was that kind of thing. And in fact, in the 60s, there was a guy, I haven't explored this too much and it should really be studied, but there was a guy in the Ontario legislature really getting ticked off at how the laws had expanded without any law change, like how the rules had expanded without law change, and how the industry seemed to be manipulating things. And it didn't go anywhere, but it was this thing where identity statements about Canada were part of the pragmatic advertising strategies of the industry.
And I always found that, and that's what I wanted to get at, because when I look back at that time period, I would say wartime to the 80s, that's where the big breweries cemented themselves as the national brewers. And then through consolidation, they owned everything, but they made their product not about the beer itself. They made it about the country. Yeah. By buying this, you're supporting the country. This is everything to do with growing a prosperous country. And then they started to get into the hockey teams and the baseball teams, and it became part of the fabric of everyday Canadian society. And
part of that was also, and there's a great book on this called Brewed in the North by Matt Bellamy, and it's about Labatt, but it's like he's a great historian.
He's from Carleton.
He's
or
Carleton, yeah, he's a great guy. You should have him on if he ever comes down. I think his family's from the area, and he demonstrates that as through the 50s and 60s, as sort of beer started to be more homogenized, less diversity in flavor, they had to identify themselves differently. And so some of these Canadianisms, like the sort of the identity of this type of Canadian, or the beer Canadian, right, came out at this time, and sort of
Canadian and blue tied to Winnipeg Blue Bombers.
And there's also regional stuff. So they would snap up these regional brewers, but keep the brand. There's a Pilsner, I think, in Saskatchewan that was like really big.
Old style Pilsner.
Yeah, and they kept the brand because that was part of that regional identity.
Kokanee with Labatt's, and very smart people running those companies, but they do tie at the emotional heartstrings of what it is to be Canada.
Yeah, unlike, I have to say, your pale ale, the Canuck pale ale.
Well, we have some fun with that. We have some apology, but it's an American.
I love that. I love that blurb, by the way.
So as an historian, are the books a means of sharing your passion for history and the scholarly work on medicine and alcohol, like combining the two? Is this something like this is what it's a passion product, but it's also what your livelihood is?
Yeah, it's my job to write. Well, I'm as scholars, we have to publish. We have to translate our knowledge to everyone's ability to understand it. But some people's abilities.
Well, I've read some papers before, and we have someone with a PhD that works on Grey Lakes, and I said, "Here, decipher this report for me, would you?"
Yeah. But as a historian, our our main product is our book, right? And so a lot of people talk about having their book. When you're a junior scholar, you do your PhD and you usually try to publish it into a book. I went a different direction because I sort of had a different route to academia after my PhD. And so the first book I did was the LCBO book. And I had such a great experience with the publisher, which is UBC Press, that I was like, geez, I want to do this again, right? And so that's when I turned to my When Good Drugs Go Bad. And then as you get deeper into a topic, like I said, Liquor in the Liberal State was kind of accidental. I had started to ask these questions, and then I realized there was a much bigger story.
Yeah,
than
it's
anyone
like
had
pulling
told.
a loose thread on your shirt, and you just keep going,
just peels
right?
away, yeah. And that's when I got into those questions about, was the temperance movement as powerful as it was, or was it just loud? Which is one of the things I argue. It's like it wasn't necessarily powerful, but it was loud, and it was in the face of politicians.
Well, we didn't have a Carrie Nation like they did in the U.S., like the Hatchetations, which we did have a beer named after her and with her likeness. And the fun fact of that, it was called My Bitter Wife, and it had the story of Carrie Nation on it. We don't do it anymore, but we got a call from someone in, I believe it was Wichita, and they said, you know what, this was my great-great-great-grandmother, and we have this little museum dedicated to her memory, and we'd love for some bottles to be shipped to us, any posters, anything you have. So we bundled up a bunch of stuff and sent it to them. So it could be on display somewhere, and we were more or less kind of shedding the light on this person used to go into saloons, taverns with a Bible in one hand and a hatchet in the other, sing hymns, and then can just bust up the place. She was arrested numerous times, but it really sparked, and there was faces to the American prohibition, whereas in Canada, I can't picture a certain person. They did it more in the group setting. So let's talk about prohibition.
Sure.
I want to talk about prohibition. I love prohibition. I love talking about prohibition,
okay.
not the prohibition.
I was going to ask what.
So
some people got really rich off prohibition.
Yeah, well, a lot of brewers did. Sleeman's wouldn't exist without prohibition. But I don't want to talk about the movement today yet. We'll get into that later. But I want to talk about the historic prohibition era, and we've touched on a lot of it. But so how have a lot of those historical regulations derived from prohibition influenced the policies that we see today?
Okay. It's really complicated, as you may imagine the first thing I say, but also there's a lot of pre-prohibition stuff, right? So that's why Liquor in the Liberal State, I looked at how we got to, like, for example, booze only being sold in taverns, in taverns, which were hotels, right? Not taverns as we might think today, just a place to drink, like a saloon or whatever.
There was a place in Toronto called the Dominion on Queen. It was a brewery first, and it had a little tavern and housing up above. And and
if you go around a lot of small town Ontario still, and even larger towns, like I don't know if it's still there in London, Ontario, but there was the something, I can't remember what it's called now, but they have the sort of the ladies and escort store along with the gentleman's store. Yep. And that is a post-prohibition requirement that the LCBO created. But the idea that people were only drinking only in hotels was a pre-prohibition thing. And that lasted until the 70s here. I mean, we did have, after 1940, I'm going to say 46, we had permission to drink in, or to create these liquor or cocktail lounges or something like that. But for the most part, most people would go to a hotel. Yeah. Whether the hotel was a really respectable place to sleep was different than, I was raised in my early years. I lived in Hespeler, Ontario, and my grandfather would be poured out of the Hespeler Hotel when he'd come to visit. He'd just go down to the Hespeler Hotel, and it was mostly a tavern, right? And that sort of stuff was shaped from pre-prohibition, but after prohibition, the idea, what happened in prohibition or happened after prohibition was that liquor licensing was centralized. So the province took complete control over it.
It was no longer municipal.
It wasn't municipal, but it also wasn't decentralized. So I'll do a very short version of this. So what I talk about in Liquor in the Liberal State is how the municipalities would license taverns or drinking spaces, but they would also hire the inspector and the license granting guy, the clerk, Sometimes they were the same guy because they weren't necessarily a full-time job. And the the license clerk got paid from the license fee. So he it was always a had kind of a vested interest in keeping these places going, because if you shut them down, you get less
money.
Fees. Yeah. Fewer fees, less money. So in the 1870s, that was changed so that these folks were employees of the provincial government, but they kept these little things called boards of license commissioners in basically every county or city in the province. But they were appointed by the provincial government. They weren't actually paid, these three guys who were just like local dignitaries who were supposed to know the region. But that led to more corruption over the next 20, 30 years. So that in the early 1900s, the government centralized this into a provincial board of license commissioners. And that is the precursor to the Liquor Control Board. So that's when things started to be centralized. And then they would send out their inspectors from hired by, at Queen's Park, some of them located there, and they would be employed to go out and inspect and make sure that everything was going right. So that was the centralization that happened. So post-prohibition in Ontario, the LCBO, and in all provinces, they started with a provincially run liquor control board. And actually most of the states, when they ended their prohibition, the northern states that bordered on Canada, most of them also had that. They had some kind of state-run control board. Further south you go, the less that happened.
Which still exists to this day.
Yes, many of them do. Some of them don't, and you'll get places like when Washington State legalized cannabis, the Liquor Control Board, or whatever it was called, took over that as well. So it was a handy government agency to make sure people act properly.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And that is one of the main sort of outcomes of prohibition. And a lot of times people say, "Oh, these prohibition-era puritanical laws," and I say, actually, because I'm an academic, I have to say, well, actually, I have to be one of those guys, right? I say, actually, it was pre-prohibition, but prohibition was the break from the past that allowed governments to create new models of doing things. Like the liquor store run by the province was a very new, not a new innovation, but the sort of thing that they just weren't able to try before. So that was a way of sort of reintroducing booze in a way that kind of kept the temperance movement from freaking out about it and allowed the government to kind of tweak the rules as they went along. And that's why we ended up with that situation in the 50s and 60s where the government, or the Liquor Control Board, or the liquor licensing agency, I can't remember which one it was.
Well, that's
didn't
the point. It's all convoluted, right?
Yes, it gets really messy, and it's really hard to find the rules because sometimes it was just an agreement. Like, yeah, you can do that.
You could be wet in the junction and or dry in the junction in Toronto, but one block over, you were completely wet. East York was famous that you couldn't drink in East York. Yeah. But if you walked across the Millwood Bridge to the first tavern, that's where everyone went.
And that's a legacy of the 1880s. Because we had a law called the Canadian Temperance Act, which allowed cities and counties to vote themselves dry. And then before that, there was a law that allowed like townships and villages and that. So then when Prohibition ended, those prohibitions remained and they still were allowed. In the town I grew up outside of London, the second half of my childhood was dry until 1984. And I talk about that.
1984.
I talk about that at the beginning of Try to Control Yourself, because I was like, why is this place dry? We have a temperance street in this town. This town has like 5 streets, and one of them is Temperance
One of our
Street.
brewers lives in Bolton on Temperance Street.
I feel like there's a Temperance Street in every town in Ontario. But this is like a town of 400 people, but it had a Temperance Street, right? And now the local LCBO agency store is on the corner, which I love.
Which is a great irony. What lessons can modern policymakers in various governments, doesn't matter if it's Ontario, across country, learn from the failures, but also some of the successes from Prohibition? I
think one of the big lessons the policymakers can learn is to remember that if people want something, they're going to find a way to get it, right? And so I often say this, Prohibition doesn't work. Some historians have said, well, it did work because people drank less. I said, yeah, but that wasn't the goal. The goal was to stop.
When they say people drank less too, again, you're an academic. Where are they getting that number from? Is it a number that was reported somewhere?
Yeah.
Whereas if you're drinking bootleg beer, it's not going to be reported anywhere, or bootleg whiskey.
Yes, and that's the challenge, right? Is the argument is when people look at the data around these times, they say when it wasn't restricted heavily and when it wasn't taxed heavily is when we get a clearer sense of what people were doing. Because there was no real incentive to go illegal.
But do you think like the big brewers back then were giving all their reporting accurate numbers?
Yeah,
probably not.
Yeah, that's.
I would say if it happened today, if it was prohibition today in Ontario,
Great Lakes Brewery would be completely above board.
We'd be completely above board, but I know a lot of the breweries would not be above board.
That's it. Yeah, sure. Throw your pals under the bus. I like it. But no, so that's one of the things that. So. Yeah, and there are ways of playing with the data to sort of recognize that, okay, so if we're dealing with the same kind of weak data as before, then a change in that data still is a change, even though we acknowledge that it's not perfect, right? So we might not be able to say this is exactly how much was sold, but we see, well, compared to that other weak data, this is lower. And so the history, I think it's not I think it's accurate to say people drank less after Prohibition, but it's not accurate to say Prohibition was successful because it didn't last, right? It was like the goal of the prohibitionists was not to get people to drink less; it was to get people to kill the industry.
To kill the industry.
Yeah, I mean, we had there was the Dominion Alliance for the Total Suppression of the Liquor Traffic, right? The Anti-Saloon League in the States also had this agenda to end alcohol, and so
they got their members elected to Congress.
Oh yeah, they were much more powerful.
Did you know years ago, a good friend of mine and a friend of the podcast, Cass Henry, we started the Anti-Saloon League here in Ontario, which is we would buy beer from the U.S. and bring it in, or from Belgium, and we drink it beers that the LCBO wouldn't bring into Ontario.
Oh yeah,
and that was a little fun thing that we had.
I had friends out of Ottawa who would order big cases of really amazing beer from Europe. It's a lot of Belgian stuff. And they called it their beer club. And it was just it was legal. It was all above board. You would go either through Quebec or Ontario and order it. Yeah. So the Anti-Saloon League is, that's a better than just beer club.
If we switch over to breweries, before touching on temperance in Canada today, what could breweries learn from the history with booze that could help us in the future? That's a very loaded question.
Yeah. I mean, I think that this will also come out when we do talk about some of the current things. But I have argued repeatedly that the industry, and first of all, the people who are, I call them anti-alcohol researchers or activists, they characterize the industry as a stereotype of like the evil guy in the top hat curling his mustache, right? Like that is
like the old propaganda posters.
Yes, absolutely.
And don't forget that he's very fat.
Yes, he's very fat. He's got really nice clothes. Like he's got expensive,
he's got money
but
coming out of his pockets.
And, and he's destroying families.
If you look at a brewery owner today, a craft brewery owner, you're not going to see that. And that's one of the challenges that I think you asked about policymakers. Policymakers have to recognize that it's much more complex than some of the simplistic ideas that are being pushed by the temperance lobby. It is, and they know this because members of the different industry groups do speak to policymakers, and at least to politicians, and that's the nature of our system. But that a lot of people, like I remember I went to a winery conference out in BC, and the people there were vintners who love their craft, and they just really love exploring wine with their customers and sharing all of these things, and they were horrified at the idea that they're somehow killing their customers, right? Which is kind of the language. Yeah. And I think that that's something, obviously we see this with craft brewing as well, that there's very few, there's big companies, but then there's a lot of very community embedded, brewers, especially vintners and craft distillers who are just engaged in this amazing craft, right, and this amazing artisan world, right, and do a lot for their community. So I think a message to the brewers is, don't focus on the
the monetary contribution
Yeah.
that you make, because that just, the temperance folks jump on it and say, see, they're just in it. They want money and it's killing people. Like, what's the price of someone's life? That stuff, which is classic. And that's like temperance 101.
Who can scream the loudest?
Yeah. But also talking about and nurturing those community connections, right?
Yeah. Talking about the third place.
Yeah. Yes. Exactly. That's what,
and that's what craft breweries are. And 90% of craft breweries in this province are in a rural community. So that is, yes, it's an economic driver, creates jobs and tourism and blah blah blah. But it's also the spot where people hold their birthday parties and they hold trivia nights, and people gather for a beer or 3 beers, but they're together. And a good friend of ours, Genwell Peepambachi, he talks a lot about social isolation and get to know a stranger. And when we talk about beer in that respect, it's you go into a bar and you meet someone new. It's the bars are still serve an importance in this society of screen time and people addicted to their phones. You go into a bar, you put your phone away, you're going to start talking to a stranger, and if it's not a stranger, it's going to be a friend, and you're going to be thinking of what the next title of a book's going to be or whatever. But it kills social isolation.
It's a cure for So when especially in the UK, where they have a big pub culture, there was a huge concern about social isolation, and colleagues of mine and I would say the cure is the pub, right? Because you don't have to drink there. You go there, you are
wrong tube.
You okay?
I'm okay.
Yeah, you go there, and here it's a little different because the relationship between the pub and and sort of ideas of where proper socialization is, for some people that's not so central. But I remember, so I did my doctorate at Queen's, and there's a brew pub there called the Kingston Brewing Company, or the Brew Pub as everyone called it, and that's where I cut my teeth on craft beer. When I came to St. Catharines, the downtown at the time wasn't really great, but there was a microbrewery about to open, the Merchant Ale House.
Still there?
It is still there. It is it was downtown through thick and thin, right? And now downtown St. Catharines is thriving. It's amazing. I walked in there the day it opened. I sat at the bar, and by the time I left, I had a community.
Yeah, of course.
Right?
Yeah.
Because I actually knew one of the bartenders already, and I met the owner, and it was like this whole thing where, hey, here's a place I can go where I'm just sitting at the bar talking to people. And I'm an introvert. Like, I don't do that a lot, but this was just kind of, it inspired that. And sometimes a couple beers helps, right? To sort of loosen, open you up a bit to talking to people.
Some people don't like the term. I like it. The social lubricant.
Yeah.
You have a couple beers, it opens you up.
Yeah, and there's a lot of research on this. It's a lot of research on how alcohol, low amounts of alcohol, when you consume it, you loosen up. And in fact, there's some really fun research saying that, the whole thing about beer goggles, like, people look better when I drink. Yeah. Well, it's actually the other way around as well. People look better when they drink because their faces relax, the tension leaves their face. And there's been some really interesting psychological research where they've shown people pictures of people having not drunk and then having a drink or two.
The smile's bigger.
Yeah. Yes, the smile's bigger. The people are relaxed, and that is somehow plays into our brains on how we assess someone's approachability.
Why do you think we get people to drink on this show?
Oh, I don't know what you're talking about. I have no idea what you're talking about.
There was just I think it was a New York Times article a couple months ago, and it was talking about the dating apps and the dating sites and all this, and they're like, ditch those.
Yeah.
Go to a bar. Yeah. Because you're going to start talking to people. You might not, find your person there, but you're going to find other people of like-mindedness, and then you're going to create a friend, and that friend might have someone for you. And it was a great article to shed light on the bar, the pub, the tavern, the saloon, whatever you want to call it, and whatever era still serves a very good. It's very important in our society.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. There's a great article that just came out in a journal called, I think, Theory and Society, by a guy from U of T, and the title was, "Should we be encouraging our PhD students to drink?" And it was about how these students who you go, you have drinks, you sort of talk about ideas. They don't do that anymore, right? And that's actually important for creativity as well, for thinking about things differently. And there's this guy at UBC, Ted Slingerland, who wrote a book called Drunk, and he's actually arguing that drunkenness, not constant like falling over, or throwing up in the curb drunkenness, but occasional bouts of drunkenness helped develop society.
Part of the Japanese culture, the business culture.
Yeah.
But it's funny that you mentioned that about the PhD students, because if you go to the Belsize, or not the Belsize, the Harvard House here in Toronto by U of T, you won't find PhD students there per se, but you'll find all the instructors and the professors. They will be there. Now that I can catch my breath, I'm gonna take a quick pause here before we get into the next segment. I'm gonna take a quick beer break, and we're gonna get festive with this next message. Hang tight, we'll be right back.
'Twas the night before Christmas, and all through the land, everyone sat happily with winter ale in hand. The aroma of winter, and cinnamon too, all natural ingredients. What a great craft brew. Winter ale from Great Lakes, the perfect holiday beer. But you should all hurry up. It's only here once a year.
Winter ale from Great Lakes Brewery at the LCBO for a very short time.
All right, I'm back. I can breathe again. Lovely winter ale. Such a lovely beer, and get it now before it's gone for the season. Okay, Dan, so far this has been amazing. I'm in my geek element here of talking about prohibition, temperance, but now I want to talk about something that's scary and for our industry. And no, it's not the bill in the Senate. It's the CCSA low-risk drinking guidelines. We're going to get to the bill in the Senate, but I've used the words prohibition, temperance a bunch of times now. So have you. So maybe we could dive into this proposed low-risk drinking guidelines that's hit the news in the last, I guess it's been almost 2 years now. Yeah, I honestly can't think of another person that could do a better job outlining that research. And I use that term with a smirk, and their wants.
Yeah.
Other than you. So can you tell the listeners what the hell I'm talking about when it comes to the CCSA low-risk drinking guidelines?
Absolutely. So this was a couple of years ago. I think it was actually, they released a report for public consultation in August of 2022. So it's been over 3 years now that it's been sort of out there and circulating. And this report, which they then released a final version in January 23, said that 2 drinks or less per week is low risk. And
I've already broken that for today. Yeah.
Hey man, no judgment here. God, I broke that like about by noon yesterday because we had a staff party. There are a lot. So I guess what happened, and I'm still trying to get a lot of data on this, is that they approached Health Canada, or Health Canada approached them, and they said, it's been about 10, 11 years since we had drinking guidance. Yeah. And that was the guidance that said, up to 10 to 15 drinks a week.
For a man.
A man. It was like, they say 15 drinks for a man, 10 drinks for a woman. In the UK, they use units, but it's basically the same amount. A half, 1 unit is half a pint. So there's like so many units for men, so many for a woman, which actually makes more sense because a standard drink in Canada is like 12 ounces of 5% beer. Yes. So I think we're breaking it here.
And I think it's a 1 ounce for spirits too.
1.5 ounce. So it's actually, if you can calculate it, if anyone really wants to do this, something to do Friday night, when you're sitting around with your friends, it's 0.6 ounces of pure alcohol. So if you multiply 12% glass of wine, 5 ounces is 12 times 5 is 60. It's 0.6, right? Same thing with 5 ounces of beer, 12 ounces of beer, 5%. You just do the math, right? So I'm
already lost.
It's okay. It's okay. But, I figured this out one day driving home. It's like, hey, how much would that be? Because I think about these things. So anyway, so that was what they argued was low risk. And the issues I had, and I did talk about this briefly earlier, is that they presented this in this shrill temperance language. They use things like, after 7 drinks a week, your risk for health, the risk to your health or whatever exponentially increases. And then in the final guidance, they changed that to radically increases. And the data tables themselves are super complicated, but they color coded them, right? So anything over, and they did what's called, it's getting a little technical here, but it's called relative risk. So relative risk is the percentage of increase of your risk of something happening based upon something else happening. So what's your risk of getting in a car accident, right? Well, then if you're drinking, your risk goes up. And I'm not
But if I'm living in Toronto, my risk goes up for just driving.
Yes. I'm not downplaying drinking and driving by any means, but if someone never drinks and drives, if they don't own a car, they have no risk of drinking and driving, right? But that's not included in that. Or the risk of contracting certain cancers and all of this stuff. And there were 16 different types of harm or types of outcomes that were linked to drinking, but three of them actually showed declines with moderate drinking, and that was cardiovascular, sort of like what's called ischemic heart disease, so the main cardiovascular heart disease, stroke, and diabetes, right? It either wasn't affected by drinking or actually was negatively, the risk went down.
The risk
right?
went down. Yeah.
And cardiovascular disease is the biggest killer of Canadians, right? So they kind of did some fiddling. I say they fiddle with numbers, and it is research, but it's just certain type of research that doesn't necessarily consider a lot of like the social and cultural things that something like drinking and socializing, as we discussed earlier, is also
or other factors that go into
or other
what
factors.
Your lifestyle is.
Yes, and it's usually based upon data of people who had really bad outcomes, and so they sort of extrapolate. They count back from, say, you're drinking 30 drinks a week and to what one drink a week would look like, but it doesn't make any sense really. But the other thing they did was in the final report, they have this table. I know this is not a very visual medium, but if you imagine a table where down the left side is all the different health harm potential outcomes, like cardiovascular disease, liver disease, cancer, these 7 different cancers. And across the top is the increase or the change in risk at 1 drink, 2 drink, 3 drink, goes up to 7 drinks, jumps to 14 drinks, then goes to 21 drinks and 35 drinks. So you see this ridiculous increase at 35 drinks a week, right? Or 21 drinks a week. And a colleague of mine who looks at this stuff for a living didn't catch that the change was 7 to 14 because that's not normally how it's represented. But it looks like 7 drinks, there's some maybe protective effects of a few things, and then 14 drinks. But that wasn't even a radical increase. So if you look at, I don't know the exact numbers they broke it down by men and women, but if you look at 7 drinks, cardiovascular disease risk is still lower, like it's -8, I think. And at 14 drinks, it's +4. So that's a very marginal increase, like a slight increase in your risk.
So almost even.
Yeah, really,
will,
it is.
yeah.
I mean, it's a sliver of increased risk, but they call this a radical increase, right? But then the other problem is that, in fact, the 8 to 13 range shows that up to 10 drinks, for example, is still protective against cardiovascular disease or stroke. So they've actually misrepresented the data. I'm not going to use the word lie because that would be uncollegial of me, but they're misrepresenting what their data shows, and they've hidden it because they haven't shown this. And so that's the one thing. But the other thing, the reason they say 2 drinks a week is they go into something called years of life loss data, which is kind of weird, but they say people say they are willing to accept the risk of 17 years of life loss per, I think, 1,000 lives, which comes down to 6 days less, a shorter life, right? Their reference is not clear, and I couldn't find the source they were talking about that said this. So and then they were saying the earlier guidance, 10 and 15 drinks, the years of life loss was about 750 per 1,000 lives, which is 3/4 of a year, right? So now you have the question to an individual: are you willing to
go from 6 days to 3/4 of a year?
Yeah, possibly lose 3/4 of your life. 3/4 of a year of your life, not 3/4 of your life. That I think I know the answer to that question. From drinking, and so it assumes what people feel is best, and then makes this hard conclusion: 2 drinks or less, based upon what I think is some really problematic assumptions around like what people are willing to risk. And there's that old joke, right? A guy says to his doctor, if I stop drinking, will I live to 100? And the doctor says, no, but it'll feel like it, right? And it's that kind of thing. It's like, if this is something that brings meaning to your life, that brings joy, that you enjoy, you meet with friends, all of that stuff. What are you willing to risk? And yet, at the same time, I'll just say this, that I think their data is really problematic, and they don't include some of the positives that are in there.
Well, I'm going to get to that question because that is my next question. But when you said the last line there about, stop drinking, live to 100 and whatever.
No, you'll feel like you live to 100.
But I always think of that old movie, Grumpier Old Men, where the guy's like, what's your secret? He's like, well, I drink 6 beers a day and I eat a pound of bacon. And he's lived to 100 years old. Okay, back to the research, though. I've seen, or I've heard, somewhere I've seen or heard, that you reference the research that went into the guidelines as temperance in disguise. And what do you mean by that? Because we've talked about research and going from, 6,000 reports to 1,600 to 16 to not peer reviewed. And
so I don't remember when I said temperance in disguise, but it is very much it is the kind of it's the representation of data in a way that skews people towards fear, right? And this is one of the outcomes of the temperance movement, is that they changed the discussion about drinking, where we always have to say stuff like, well, we know that alcohol causes problems, but now I don't have to say that. If someone asked me for a ride to the mall, I don't have to say, well, I might drive into a building on my way and I could get in an accident and we could all die or something. We don't have to give those what we know could happen, but we do have to, it seems, to frame any discussion of drinking around like we know that it's harmful, because we live in this world where alcohol is framed as a problem to be managed instead of something that can bring joy, right? And so that is why it's like temperance in disguise, because it's research. They're doing database research, but when you choose what you choose. So you mentioned this. So the CCSA report is based on about 6,000 studies, and when they produced the report, the August discussion, because it hit the media and they had a big media blitz, they talked about how this is based on 6,000 studies. So, I mean, that assuming, well, that must be good because $6,000, like that's a lot of studies. Well, what they did was they took 6,000 and they filtered it down to 16, several of which were published by the people who wrote this this report, or the team from Victoria University that wrote this report. And then they made these conclusions. And the report comes with what's like a technical guide, like how they made the selection, and they based it upon, like, they have different ways of measuring quality of research and stuff like that. And all the research, for the most part, was they deemed very low quality. But the reason it's very low quality is because it's not like one of those trials, like a placebo-controlled trial, where you get a whole bunch of mice and you divide them into groups and you do different things.
Here's a white pill, here's a blue pill. Yeah,
exactly. So it can't be high quality, but they say in this report, we're just, for the sake of getting some results, we're going to assume that they are moderate quality. Yeah. It's like, well, what they're basically saying is we can't give you an answer. I can write
a report that says that too, that says beer's really good for you.
Yeah, most of my books are high quality. Yeah. I mean, let's be honest. But so we, so there's those sorts of assumptions around it. And what it comes down to is they're saying we need to come up with an answer to this question of what's better, or what's a new guidelines. And there seems to be a race to the bottom among these groups of researchers around the world, like in Australia and Ireland and here in Canada, where they really seem to be like, who's the first one that can find the research that shows alcohol is absolutely no
well,
good.
You've seen a lot of those reports, and we've seen it in, talking with different folks. They're saying, well, Ireland's going to do this. Yeah. And they're waiting to see what they do to then say, okay, well, see what they did. We need to adopt that.
We can do it. Yeah, and it's the same thing. It's a strange thing where there's these three countries in the so-called Anglo-American world where I think part of the culture is a drinking culture. Like Ireland, Canadians think we are hard drinking, but we're not all that hard drinking when you look at the numbers. And Australia, a bunch of
our drinking population, our drinking statistics are continuously going down.
They're going down, and they've always been lower than a lot of other countries. But we've always had this perception.
Again, going back to the prohibition era and the big brewers pitching themselves as Canada is beer. Beer is Canada.
Yeah.
When you do look at the countries and you're like, oh, Canada's way down the list of per consumption or per capita consumption.
Yeah.
As a scholar, as an academic, in your research, how do you evaluate the balance between public health concerns and economic interests? So you're taking the historical policies, you're taking the health harms or the perceived health harms, and you're taking economic interests and putting them together and to say, okay, well, if I'm seeing this from a harm reduction, or not harm reduction, but harm, and then you have this for your communities and your hubs and your growing community, and then you have the history.
Yes. Well, that's a really tough question to answer. I mean, one of the challenges is that the idea of talking about health harm is sort of like the moral equivalent of 150 years ago talking about the damage to the family or moral, like immorality, right?
Paycheck goes straight to the saloon.
That sort of thing, yeah. And it's, I mean, there's a great book called Against Health, and the subtitle is How Health Became the New Morality, which is where health messaging is used as a way of judging people's character. How can you possibly be eating that, that huge cake? You're overweight, that kind of thing. It judges a person by their health behavior, or their behavior that is deemed as related to health, right?
Not what's going on in their head. It's
or the person they are, right? It's all of, and so that is, so in some ways that has become a new hammer to beat people down. I'm trying to extend the analogy. But so that's one of the challenges. And so when, and that's why I said earlier, industry has to kind of stay clear of some of those economic arguments, because it makes it look like the balance is between an individual's life and some company's profits. And yet at the same time, as we've discussed earlier, and we see all around us, there is a clear connection between happiness and enjoyment and community and places in which to do that, right? And some of them include alcohol. And historically, even, we saw that as some communities went dry in Ontario, the hotels would close because they couldn't afford to stay open without that revenue. And when the hotels closed, people coming into the town, like traveling salespeople, that was a big part of industry, was to get into a town and then sell your products to stores to sell. They had no place to go. And so they were saying to the government, you have these rules are destroying our ability to do our job.
The ripple effect.
So the way the tavern was also one of those third spaces at the time, a place where they could store their goods. Farmers would go there on market days, and they would have places for their horses and their wagons and their products and things like that. So it was kind of an important part of the economy, not just because people are making money, but because it was sort of a pivotal place to within the trade, the way people did things.
It was a community center with a hockey rink attached to it.
Some of which have bars in them.
Yes, well now, lacrosse. We were a big sponsor of Mimico Lacrosse, and so when you go watch a lacrosse game, you can enjoy a beer with that. S202.
Oh, lovely.
So the CCSA and their ludicrous proposed guidelines aren't all that's threatening our industry, not even close. An industry that has been in existence, like you said, since mankind. Tell me about Senator Patrick Brazeau's bill that's in the Senate right now. Again, within a pint.
Yeah. Okay. I'll do real quick.
Bill S202.
Bill S202, and it was in the Senate before. Government was prorogued, so it had a different number then. And it was interestingly coincided with the CCSA's first guidance document coming out.
I think that I'm not a conspiracy theory by any
sure
means,
it was completely
but I think
accidental. Because the people at the CCSA had nothing to do with writing that law, which I'm pretty sure they did. So this is a law that would mandate 4 labeling requirements on alcohol packaging. One would be, I think, like nutrition information, like calories,
which I think a lot of the industry's fine with.
Yeah. And a lot of them do it already. So nutrition information, how many standard drinks is in a package. Then some sort of note about the.
But what's different is in Ontario it's 12 ounces.
Yeah.
Is it 12 ounces in Canada?
It's a standard that is considered, I think.
Okay.
Yeah. And I'm not sure if that's something Health Canada created or the researchers created, but the idea of the standard drink. Standard drinks in different countries are slightly different, but they're all around the same amount, right? So it will be like a standard drink statement. And we see this in the UK. They have this beer amounts to this many units, right? Which I think was an industry decision. It wasn't implemented by government. Then there would be something around the like capturing the guidelines. So saying, 10 drinks for women, 15 drinks for men, or if the CCSA gets its way, two. And then a final statement that is this
is the scary one,
is a cancer warning. And it's saying that something like alcohol causes cancer. Well, what Brazeau said in his literature was like, alcohol causes cancer. And I was at this thing, this really weird event, and they handed me one of these things, and I edited it for him. And it was like, alcohol may increase your risk of some cancers, but not the most deadly ones, and in fact reduces your risk of other things that are more likely to kill you. But that's really hard to put on a label, right? So they don't go for that. They want this cancer label. It is based upon some really problematic research that happened in the Yukon in 2017-18 when they put labels on booze bottles and like these bright yellow and red labels with these 4 messages. They did that in, I think, November 2017. It was supposed to be an 8-month study, but after a couple months, the liquor industry said, hey, those are our products and you can't do that. They threatened to sue the liquor board and all this stuff, so they took them off. But nevertheless,
they took the findings from the nut.
Nevertheless, they have so far. I've counted 8 peer-reviewed articles on that study, which is a deeply flawed, problematic study from anyone who's reasonably looking at it. Even doing something over 8 months, looking at drinking, is not enough, right? Because our drinking patterns change throughout the year. In the summer, we drink different things. After New Year's, people tend to stop drinking as much, all of those sorts of things, right? So just to do an 8-month thing, there's all sorts of reasons. And actually at the Senate hearing I went to, I had 4 minutes to explain that. So thanks for they didn't say in a pint either. So that would have been funny. So it's based upon this study that was deeply flawed, and all they showed was that people kind of were aware of these labels, right? Because after 2 months, when the industry said, you got to stop, it became big news. So everyone, of course, if you're going to survey someone in like February saying, do you know about these labels? Everyone's going to be like, yeah, of course I know about these labels, right? So it was those were problematic, but they published a bunch of studies, which means if you go onto any academic searches and look at labeling research recently, all you'll see is how effective it was, even though it wasn't effective because we haven't seen behavior change in this, which is what they're trying to do. But also, this cancer warning is really problematic because there is evidence that at least 2 kinds of cancer, alcohol is protective in those cases, one of which is the cancer that killed my dad, lymphoma, and the other one is, I think, kidney or bladder cancer. I can't remember which one. But they're focusing on the harm increase, right? They don't talk about the fact that cardiovascular disease is still protective against cardiovascular disease at moderate drinking, and that is the biggest killer of Canadians, right? So there's all of these things that they've put their thumb on the scale, and then at the same time with their other 2 hands, because temperance people have 3 hands, I guess. One hand has the thumb on the scale, the other hands have their hands over their ears saying, I can't hear you, I can't hear you.
Hear no evil, see no evil, or whatever. But the temperance, you mentioned the temperance, this has all the earmarks because they take everything. They take not spirits, not wine.
It's everything.
It's everything causes cancer.
Yeah, and there is a logical utility in doing that type of research. So which is if you just ask people how much beer you drink and then try to come up with outcomes from that.
Blah, 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 blah,
yeah, it doesn't necessarily, if they also drink whiskey or wine. So if you say, how much do you drink, and try to get people to calculate it. We know through research, even people who were part of the CCSA study have published on the fact that people routinely underreport their drinking by 30 to 50%.
For sure. What do you say when you go to the doctor?
I say I drink as much as I need to. I do. Yeah. And she knows, because she knows exactly what
my first question every time is, well, you work in the beer industry, so how much are you drinking? I was like, is that relevant to me coming in for what I'm coming in for?
Yeah. No, my doc's like, yeah, no, I know what you're doing, Dan. It's okay. excuse me, because a lot of doctors also they like to have a drink at the end of the day too. And they kind of, I had a lot of people contact me about this saying, thank you for saying what you're saying, and including physicians, because they think some of these rules are
well, that's why I really wanted to get you on the show, because I want,
but just
our 5 million listeners every week.
But I just want to finish the story is that, so because of the concerns about muddying the waters between wine and spirits and beer, they just talk about grams of alcohol. And the problem with that is that it further distances us from what we actually do when we drink, right? Where I'm going to drink a beer or wine in certain contexts, or I might have whiskey at certain. So it's different times you drink it for different reasons and of different social situations and things like that. It completely lifts it out of any social reality and just makes it this mechanical, what we call dose response, which is not realistic, but it's how they're framing the story.
I want to kind of end this before we get into what's next with Dr. Dan Malleck, but one of the senators wouldn't stop with who pays for your research, and that's why I wanted to get that right off the top that you're here, because we're just chatting. That was their line of questioning, which you took offense to. You could see it in your face. Did you have to comply with that request to submit research?
Pending? So well, interesting, because she
I hate to cut you off, because your answer was, did you ask anyone else? And they're like, no, you're the only academic. And I'm like, but all these people have vested interest in what they're testifying to.
Yes, absolutely. My answer was, I can't remember. I remember seeing red. I was irritated also because the statement I made, I started off by saying, I'm not.
You're not. You said it numerous times. I don't think it was just once. I think numerous
I had
times.
to say that also because they wanted me to say things for industry, and I had to make it very clear I don't speak for industry. I speak to
They kept asking you
industry
questions about how does the industry feel about this?
And I kind of felt bad because I had to throw it to Brad, even though I knew I could have an answer to sort of how they were framing that question. And
that's Brad Goddard. He's the chair of the Canadian Coalition of Independent Craft Brewers.
And he was the only person from industry who showed up. And at the time I was irritated, but then I realized this is just a setup to try to get industry to say things that they, anyway. So I was really irritated by that because one of the things that Brazeau had been doing since the first week, since he gave his testimony, if anyone wants 8 hours of absolute frustration, they can watch these. It was really frustrating to see the number of softball questions thrown at Brazeau as the so-called author of this bill, and all the researchers and public health people who were repeating literally the same talking points. The main one being alcohol is a group 1 carcinogen, just like tobacco and asbestos. They didn't mention it's also like bacon, estrogen, diesel fumes,
anything
wood.
barbecued. You eat a lot of barbecued food.
Maillard reactions, right?
And where's my research on that? I don't have any. It's just something I said. But a lot of what happens with the beer industry is what someone, like you just said, they take the research and they water it down to, this fits in with our narrative.
But their narrative is like to go the worst place, which is tobacco and asbestos that everyone. Sorry, I hit the mic. That everyone is
can buy into.
But everyone is familiar with, right?
Because they have the research to back those claims up.
But the list of group 1 carcinogens is 135 items long. Right. You could have said it's a group 1 carcinogen like bacon and estrogen, and it wouldn't sound as terrifying. But that was one of the talking points. And you knew it was a talking point that was handed to these folks because they didn't always use the right language. It's not a class A. It's not a group A. It's a group 1 based upon this organization, the International Alliance on Cancer Research, or International Council on Cancer Research, or something like that. Agency. That's what it is. So Brazeau started with these softball questions. All the other people were handed softball questions, and one of the things Brazeau said is, if you have any researchers who come in here and try to disagree with this law, you got to follow their research because they're paid by industry. And I went, oh, I can't wait to be here because I knew that's the not normal line.
But then follow back where this all came from to find out where and who could be behind a lot of these reports, and it comes back to the Templars and but anyway, so one of the challenges is we have in the business of academia
Our job is to publish, to get our work out there, to hopefully maybe make social change, depending on what you do. If you do health research, and it's a really big feather in your cap or thorn in your side for other people if when you do this. So there's an incentive to have your research that widespread, to get that far. Then the public health people, they look at things around trying to convince people to be healthier. So that's their incentive. And there are some international temperance organizations that are still around who are very clear that they want to end alcohol by consensus, which means everyone has to agree to the same facts. Yep. And so they're all simplifying the story, trying to find out how can we prove to people that alcohol is a problem, instead of saying, is alcohol a problem? Yeah. And in what context is it? In what context isn't it? Which is more honest, I think, research. But also it doesn't necessarily get you the research funding, because a lot of the funding is around alcohol as harm, like in the sense of let's look at alcohol harms and how to end them. So it's a really complicated research area, and like that's why I don't have funding. There's actually no funding for the type of stuff I'm talking about.
You're doing it on your own?
Yeah, I do it on my own, but also it just irritates me that they're trying to scare people. Mm-hmm. And because we also know fear, worry, stress, anxiety, those are have negative health outcomes. Yeah. Right. But they don't think about that. Yeah. They just think about alcohol having negative health outcomes, which it doesn't always have. I just want to clarify.
Let's shift gears a bit and just what's next for you in your research? Well, you have a new book. You said you're working. I'm
part
3.
Yeah, I'm trying to finish a project on the history of pharmacy, which is not related to this much at all. But the next project I'm thinking of doing is in that I'm trying to get funded. I just put a funding grant application in on the history of prohibition, but I want to look at it from the government side. Like, how did the government try to make it work, right? As opposed to just stories of bootleggers and rum runners and stuff like that.
Sign me up for a copy.
Well, we'll see if it comes together. It's going to be a big project because we had prohibition in every province. It was slightly different, right?
Yep.
So
except Quebec
had a few months of a really watered down, not really. They were never really. They were
like, come on, beers or booze is part of our culture.
And wine. Yeah, and it was. Yeah, Quebec's always been sort of an outlier on that, but so I'm hoping to start that project, but it's going to take a while. So there won't be a book anytime soon, but when there is one, I'll send you a copy.
All right. What trends in alcohol regulation or public opinion do you think will shape the next 10 years?
Oh man,
this is a loaded one, but I need a quicker answer off you.
Yeah, I the quickest answer is I have no idea. I mean, what's happening now is there is an increasing blowback to this kind of overly restrictive license or alcohol research. Mm-hmm. But it really comes down, like I said, historically, politicians haven't been in favor of these kinds of restrictions, not only because they know people won't like them, but they're just hard to enforce, right? So I don't know where it's going. There's definitely an interest in what I call the anti-alcohol people of sort of just continuing to push this story so that people start to say, oh, maybe I just should stop drinking.
Yeah. Right? They're getting away from the legislative changes to the public perception or the yeah.
Well, it's
doing media as opposed to lobbying.
Policy and law change goes hand in hand with perception change. So what they're trying to, someone sent me an article yesterday where a person was saying we need to soften the ground to make these changes more palatable. It's like, well, maybe just accept why people don't want these changes.
Soften the ground. That's it. Just people are just thinking up new business terms.
Well, it's this really weird First World War term where they would bomb the crap out of the other side before going over the top, right? It's like, okay, we're back
soften the ground so we can dig it. Yeah.
We're back in the temperance industry. I don't know.
All right. The last question before we get into rapid fire. What should breweries be mindful of? You said about the economic stuff, talking about that, but the community thing. What are you hearing in your circles that breweries should be really paying attention to other than what we discussed?
I kind of think I've already
touched on that.
Yeah, I don't know if there's much else. Definitely talking about it, talking to each other, and not allowing different types of industries to divide themselves. So don't say, well, we're at least we're not spirits.
Right? Back to the Labatts and the Molsons and whatever.
So but also like in the 19th century, the the beer and cider people were saying, "Oh, we're not spirits. We should get exemptions," and none of them did. Right.
Yeah.
So
Work together is what you're saying.
Yeah. Recognize that the temperance industry is pushing alcohol as a unit, not as a different types.
Yeah.
And I think the brewers and distillers and vintners and cideries and that have to do the same thing. They have to talk about it together.
Beautiful. So we're going to get into rapid fire. We're going to catch our breath, take a drink, and come back in a moment. Hang tight.
Hey peoples, Octo here. I like a good punch-up from time to time, but after too many donuts lately, I gotta get down to my proper poundage. So my sparring partners at GLB brewed a beer just for me, Fighting Weight Session IPA. Big flavor, but it's 3.6% ABV and only 100 calories. It's the perfect beer between training sessions, then get back to some truculent head busting. Fighting Weight Session IPA from GLB, now at the LCBO and select beer stores across Ontario. Hey, losing a few never tasted so good.
That was a lot of excellent information, Dan. Stuff that I think a lot of folks in the industry will appreciate hearing for sure. Rapid fire time.
Okay.
What beer have you been enjoying recently that's not a Great Lakes?
Oh man, my answers were Great Lakes. One of my favorite beers is Ransack the Universe from
Collective Arts.
Okay. It's solid. Yeah.
Worst part about Canada's prohibition era?
That it ended because it was such a worst part. I mean, it did nurture. What do you call it? The illegal networks and the organized crime. So that was one thing.
Organized crime.
It also sort of killed a lot of regional breweries.
Yeah. Well, 100% it did.
Yeah.
All over the country.
Yes.
Name a brewery that consistently impresses you.
Okay, I have to say Great Lakes Brewing, and this is, and I'll tell you why. And this isn't just a line, because you guys have a variety, a wide variety. You're not like fixated on only IPAs, which I love. I love IPAs. And you guys do some really solid English styles that a lot of people don't do, like milds, bitters, and that's one of my favorite styles.
Nice. Our Monty ESB is tasting so good right now. Best time and place for a beer?
Best time and place. Anyone's local pub, and I would say, because I'm old now, and if I start drinking at noon, I'm asleep by 4. I'll say maybe starting around 4, and drawing it out a bit.
If you could just drink one beer for the rest of your life, what would it be?
I'm going to go back to Ransack.
Okay. Yeah. He's never invited back here again. If you weren't a historian and professor in health sciences, what would you be doing?
I don't know. I really love this job, and I would probably be doing the same thing, but not getting paid for it. I don't know.
Okay.
It's hard question to answer.
Now, I didn't share this question with you earlier.
Okay.
But if you had to create a beer named after one of your research topics or historical characters, what would it be?
Oh, that's a good one. I could do. You know what? I would call it Ben Spence's Bitter, because Ben Spence was a big temperance guy.
Okay.
A really big name. Well, there were 2 Spences, but I maybe just call it Spence's Bitter.
Okay.
And to name a beer after him would probably be pretty fun. Yeah. And the fact that it's bitter would have that double meaning.
What was the other one? Johnny Apple, or not Johnny Apple? Johnny Barleycorn, or
John Barleycorn. Yeah, you could do a John Barleycorn.
That'd be a good one.
Yeah, you're right. That would be maybe. Well, I mean, if you know anyone in the brewing industry who might want to name a beer, go for it.
If you could have a beer with just one person in the whole world, dead or alive, famous or not, who would you choose?
Yeah. So this may sound like a cop-out, but there's a reason. I would love it to be my dad. And I'll say this because he died when I was 23, and I wasn't into beer then, and he was a huge fan of beer, and he would always go to places. This is in the early 90s. He would go places and say, what have you got that's different? And he kind of missed the whole craft beer revolution. Yeah. So I've lamented ever since then that I never got to sit and have a beer with my dad and sort of explore the beer. So that's the answer.
That's a nice one. Yeah. Best hangover cure?
I'm going to say coffee because it's a vasodilator. I'll go health sciences on you. Greasy eggs and bacon if you eat it because the oil replenishes the lipids in your stomach, and a lot of water.
But bacon may cause cancer.
Yeah, it might. It might. Yeah, it might. Or if two
I
negatives
shouldn't laugh at that, but
it's we have to recognize the context of these sorts of things. But also, if two negatives makes a positive, then maybe it.
All right.
I'm a historian, not a mathematician. How can you tell?
Dan, I really enjoyed this conversation. Really eye-opening chat filled with a lot of great information and great takeaways. And thank you for coming on, for the work that you do and the work still ahead, and for sharing your story today on the pod.
Thank you. It's absolutely my pleasure to be here. Thanks a lot.
And that's it. That's all, folks. Episode 51 with Dr. Dan Malleck, professor at Brock University, consultant on alcohol policy, and author, has moved from the mash tun to the fermenters. If you enjoyed our conversation or any other episodes, please leave a review or a comment wherever you get your podcasts. Today's episode was fueled by cans of Great Lakes Lager. You can find cans of this super crushable, gold medal winning, supreme valued lager all across Ontario at the LCBO, the beer store, grocery, and convenience stores, and at both GLB retail locations. You can find it online at greatlakesbeershop.ca for free local home delivery. And the best part about this beer, other than its amazing taste, it's only $50 a case. You can visit the brewery at 30 Queen Elizabeth Boulevard in Etobicoke, or grab some delicious eats and fresh pours at our brew pub at 11 Lower Jarvis Street, Toronto. If you have any questions or content you'd love to hear us discuss on the show, guest ideas, or just want to tell us what you're drinking, drop us a line at podcast@greatlakesbeer.com. Until next time, please remember to keep tipping your glass of fresh GLB in the right direction. Supporting local never tasted so good.